Hi, my name is Gary Hinolan. I'm the Partner Technology Advisor for Microsoft Philippines. What I do is I train partners on how to sell all the products of Microsoft, from Windows Client, Windows Server, Server Application, and to cloud services. I also do deep dive licensing training and technical training to partners and customers. So today we will discuss the Windows Server 2012 R2 licensing. Now just a background, Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2 is a separate product. It's not a free upgrade. So if you want to have a Windows Server 2012 R2, you need to purchase the license. Windows Server 2012 R2 is it's a newer version. It has more features versus the Windows Server 2012, but they have the same licensing. Now before we start with the licensing, we need to discuss first the end of support for Windows Server 2003 and 2003 R2. As we can see, Windows Server 2003 started last April 24th of 2003. It's almost more than 12 years. And the mainstream support ended last July 13th of 2010. And the extended support ends on July 14th of 2015. After July 14, there will be no security updates. And then the most question I get is, what will happen if the Windows Server 2003 has ended? Will I get a blue screen of death? Will my server just die and crash? Well, Windows Server 2003 end of support is almost the same as Windows XP end of support. It means the operating system will still continue to run, but there will be no security updates. There are 37 critical updates released in 2013 for Windows Server 2003 and 2003 R2 under extended support. As we can see, the number of updates are getting lesser from March 15 to June 15 until there will be no updates developed or released after the end of support. It also means there will be no compliance. Lack of compliance with various standards and regulations can be devastating. This may include various regulatory and industry standards for which compliance can no longer be achieved. For example, lack of compliance with payment card industry. Data security standards might mean companies such as Visa and MasterCard will no longer do business with you. Or the new cost of doing business will include paying catastrophic penalties and high transaction fees if you're using Windows Server 2003. And no safe haven. Both virtualized and physical instances of Windows Server 2003 are vulnerable and would not pass compliance audit. A good example is some of the customers might think, like, if I have a Windows Server 2003, I can convert it to a virtual machine. It's called P2V, converting physical server to a virtual machine. Now, once they have the virtual machine 2003, they will put it on a physical host of Windows Server 2012, an example. So it's still not secure, including Small Business Server 2003 are also affected. I know a lot of customers that are still using Small Business Server 2003. And staying with Windows Server 2003 will cost more in the end. Maintenance costs for aging hardware will also increase. Added costs will be incurred for intrusion detection systems, more advanced firewall, network segmentation, and so on, simply to isolate Windows Server 2003 servers. Also, with old servers, with old processors, consumes a lot of power. Many applications will cease to be supported once the operating systems they are running are end of life. This also includes Microsoft application. So start planning your migration and transforming your data center today with Windows Server 2012 R2. But there's a great news. Windows Server 2012 R2 offers relatively good application compatibility with Windows Server 2003 according to IDC. So there's a big chance that some of your 2003 Windows Server 2003 application will work in Windows Server 2012 R2. And then we can consolidate server infrastructure by virtualizing Windows Server 2012 R2 data center, which greatly simplifies licensing and deployment concerns and reduce costs. We will discuss this further later on, and how you can save with Windows Server Hyper-V virtualization. We also have major improvements in Windows Server, including security, virtualization, and enterprise-grade management enhancement. Microsoft can help you with tools and resources such as Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit, and Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, which is free. You can download it on a website. You can run this tool to test if you can migrate from 2003 to Windows Server 2012 R2. Now we will discuss the enhancement and virtualization. So we started virtualization with Windows Server 2008 R2, and there were a lot of complaints from partners, resellers, and customers that Windows Server virtualization before was slow. Well, when we started virtualization with 2008 R2, we can only support up to 4 processors, and if a customer wants to have a more processor, then we can't work with it, because we can only support up to 4 processors with 2008 R2, and we can only support up to 64 gig of memory and 2 terabytes of hard drive for the virtual machine. But today, with Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2, we can support up to 64 processors in a virtual machine, 1 terabyte of memory, and 64 terabytes for the storage. Now, I've asked some VMware resellers, and they told me that the specification, only the specification, not the features, are the same with VMware. But the big difference is Hyper-V Windows Server 2012 is included, no charge, versus with VMware you have to purchase the license. Now let's discuss what is virtualization. With Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2, we have something called Hyper-V. So what is Hyper-V and what is virtualization? So here's an example. If you're not doing virtualization, if you have 3 physical servers, it means you paid for the 3 physical servers, and you would have to buy 3 licenses of servers for each physical server. And most of the time, if you're not doing virtualization, it's underutilized, so you're just wasting your investment. Instead of doing that, we can consolidate the servers using Hyper-V and virtualization. So now, instead of having 3 physical servers, I can have the 2 physical servers, virtualize it in 1 physical host. So you can save money and energy. Instead of buying 3 licenses and 3 physical servers, just to buy 1. And it's easier to manage. Instead of managing 3 physical servers, I just have to manage 1 physical server. And it's fast and easy to deploy servers. So if I need to have a physical server, let's say if I'm a developer, if I want to test my application, I don't have to buy a physical server. I can just create a virtual machine, and I can have a virtual machine in just a minute. So most of the customers are still afraid of doing virtualization. Maybe some are not doing virtualization because they don't want to put all the eggs in just one basket, because if the physical server fails, then all the virtual machine fails. So here's the benefits if you're doing virtualization. So remember again the example I made earlier. If I want to have a physical server, now I just have to create a virtual machine. It only takes a minute. Now, if a virtual machine fails, I can create a snapshot. So it's like I can restore my virtual machine in a good state. Now, if a physical server fails, I can move this virtual machine on a separate server, on a separate physical server. It's like I can move the egg in a different basket. And we can do this using the failover clustering or live migration with Windows Server 2012 R2, which is also included, no charge, the features. Now we will discuss the differences between the VMware licensing versus the Windows Server 2012 R2 licensing for Hyper-V. Now we need to understand how to license VMware. In this example, we have 1 physical server with 2 processors. And VMware is licensed per processor. So if you have 2 physical processors, it means you need to buy 2 VMware licenses. And most of the time, if a customer creates a virtual machine, you put Windows Server. So in this example, if you have 2 virtual machines with Windows Server, I just need to buy 1 Windows Server 2012 R2 standard license. So all in all, it's almost like bought like 3 licenses, 2 for VMware and 1 for Windows Server. Now, we will compare it with Hyper-V, which is included in Windows Server 2012. 1 physical server with 2 processor, right? Hyper-V is no charge, it's included. I don't need to buy the hypervisor. For 2 physical server with Windows Server Standard, I can create 2 virtual machine with licenses included inside the virtual machine, no charge. So see the big differences? With VMware, I need to buy 3 licenses versus with Hyper-V, with the same setup, with the same specification, I only need just 1 license. And we've simplified the Windows Server 2012 R2 licensing with the 2 main features, which is the standard and data center. They have the same licensing, they have the same features with data center and standard. The only difference is the number of virtual machine. But all in all, we have 4 editions in Windows Server 2012 R2. So we have Foundation, Essentials, Standard, and Data Center. So Foundation is licensed for 1 processor and for 15 users only. You don't need to buy client access license for Foundation. And what if you have more than 15? Let's say you had a 16th user. Do you need to buy calls? The answer is no, because there is no calls for Foundation. So if it's more than 15 users, then you need to have an Essentials. Essentials is licensed for 2 processors and for 25 users and no calls. So the differences between Foundation and Essentials is it's per license. Foundation is licensed per 1 processor versus Essentials is licensed for 2 processor. And then Foundation is for 15 users only, no calls, and Essentials is 25 users, no calls. And if let's say Essentials, if we have a 26 users, do you need to buy calls? Again, the answer is no. If it's more than 25 users, then a customer needs to buy Windows Server Standard. And Standard is licensed for 2 processor plus calls for each users or devices connecting to the server. While Data Center it's for 2 processor and calls per users and devices connecting to the server. The Standard and Data Center, both features are the same. The only difference is the number of virtual machine. So Windows Server Standard is for 2 processor and 2 virtual machine. Data Center for 2 processor, unlimited virtual machine. And here's the estimated retail price for Windows Server Standard. It's $882. While Windows Server 2012 Data Center, or Windows Server 2012 R2 Data Center rather, is $6,155. That's an estimated retail price. And if you want to see the pricing, you can go at the bottom on the link to get the pricing for Windows Server 2012 R2. Now I'm going to show you a guide on how to license Windows Server 2012 Standard. So we have 3 columns: number of licenses, number of processors, it's a physical processor, and a number of virtual machines. So to get the license for Windows Server Standard, we base it which one is higher versus the number of processors versus the number of virtual machines. Then that's the number of licenses. So an example, if a physical server with 2 processors and let's say with 5 virtual machines, so 2 versus 5, since 5 is higher, you need to have 3 licenses. So let's do another example. Let's say 4 physical processor and 8 virtual machine. So 4 versus 8. Since 8 is higher, then you need to have 4 licenses of Windows Server Standard. Last example, 4 processor and 1 virtual machine. Since 4 is higher, then you need to have 2 licenses of Windows Server Standard. So that's the first step on Windows Server 2012 Standard licensing guide. We need to count the number of processors and the number of virtual machines. Then the next step is we need to ask what license is inside the virtual machine. So this is how it works. imagine if you have one physical server with two physical processor. So that's one license of Windows Server Standard, right? And then Hyper-V is included, no charge. And remember, with Windows Server Standard, 2 processor plus 2 virtual machine. With 2 licenses inside the virtual machine, no charge. Now let's say if a customer wants to add 2 more virtual machine with Windows Server Standard, then that's additional license. Now remember, this is the second step. We need to ask what operating system is inside the virtual machine, because if the virtual machine license is Linux, then there's no charge. In short, we only count the number of Microsoft licenses inside the virtual machine. So that's how you license Windows Server Standard. With Windows Server 2012 R2 Data Center we just count the number of processors, because the virtualization is unlimited. So if you have 2 processors, it's 1 license. You have 4 processors, 2 licenses. Now, how about the downgrade and down edition rights for Windows Server 2012 R2? Windows Server 2012 Data Center, you can downgrade to a lower version and lower edition. So for example, if you have a data center, I can downgrade to Data Center Enterprise Standard Web and Titanium. Titanium. I can go down to 2012 to 2008 R2 to 2008. Same thing with Standard. You can downgrade to a lower version and lower edition. And even you can downgrade until 2003. But I don't recommend customers to downgrade to Windows Server 2003 because it's already end of life. So next question is, if Windows Server Standard and Data Center has the same features, but they have the only difference is the number of virtual machines. So when do you purchase Data Center? So if a customer wants to create more than 12 virtual machines, it's better to buy one Windows Server Data Center Standard. One Windows Server Data Center instead, because it's more cheaper to buy Windows Server 2012 R2 Data Center than buying 7 standards. And another thing to consider, remember when I said we can move virtual machine from one physical server to another using failover clustering or live migration? So in this scenario, we have a disaster recovery option with live migration of failover clustering. So with server 1, we have 2 virtual machines, while server 2 has only 1 virtual machine. Now, if I want to move the virtual machine from server 1 to server 2, so that's fine, because in server 2, you have 2 virtual machines for standard. That's okay, assuming each physical server has two processor. Now, let's do a different scenario. 2 physical processor each on each physical server, and 2 virtual machine each on physical server. Now, if I'm going to move the virtual machine from server 1 to server 2, as you can see, server 2 needs additional license, because remember, with Windows Server Standard, it's 2 processor and 2 virtual machine. Now, since in this scenario it's more than 2 virtual machines, then they need to add additional license. So it's better to get Data Center if you keep moving virtual machines, so that you don't have to keep counting how many virtual machines you move. So in this example, 2 physical servers with 2 virtual machines. If I move 1 virtual machine, that's fine, because with Data Center I have unlimited virtual machine. Now let's discuss the client access license. So there are 2 types of client access license. So we have the Windows Server call and the remote desktop services call. And in Windows Server call and RDS call, you have user call and device call as well. So let's discuss one by one. So selecting the right client access license, if it's going to be user call or device call. So with user call, it's one user with unlimited devices. And for device call, it's one device and unlimited users is the opposite. So let's do a scenario when to purchase user call versus device call. So the first example, we have a user call. A user call can use any device to connect to the server. And device call, this is the only device that can connect to the server, and you have multiple users using the device at a time. And another benefit, if you're going to use user call, if the user is roaming, if the user goes to a different location and wants to use a different device, then the user can connect to the server, to a different device. While in the device call, in this scenario, let's say one of the user who doesn't have a user call and use a different device to connect to the server, it's not allowed. So device call is better for those in the company who are sharing devices, while user call is basically for users who are roaming and can connect to different devices to the server. And Windows Server calls, client access licenses, are version specific. So calls should be the same versions for Windows Server. So same version, or client access license should be the same version or higher. So in this example, let's start with Windows Server 2012 client access license. So it should be the same version, right, or higher. So Windows Server 2012 call is the same version with Windows Server 2012 operating system, and it's basically the 2012 call is higher than the Windows Server 2008 and 2003. So Windows Server call should be the same version or higher on the operating system. So if you have a Windows Server 2012, I can access, if you have a Windows Server 2012 client access license, I can connect to Windows Server 2012, I can connect to 2008, and I can connect to 2003. And also, Windows Server 2012 call is also the same client access license for Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows Server 2012. So there's no such thing as Windows Server 2012 R2 call. It's only Windows Server 2012. So how about if I have a Windows Server 2008 call? So again, it should be the same version or higher to the operating system. So if I have a 2008 client access license, I can connect to 2008 and I can connect to 2003, but I cannot connect to the Windows Server 2012 because the operating system is higher than the client access license. And if I have a Windows Server 2003 client access license, I can only connect to the Windows Server 2003, but not for 2008 and Windows Server 2012. So calls from any previous Windows Server version works only for that version or any previous version. Here's another scenario. Let's say I have 3 physical servers. Does it mean I need to buy 3 calls for one user? So 1 calls can suffice for the 3 physical servers as long as within the company or affiliated in the company. So I don't need to buy client access license for each physical server for just one user or device. Now for RDS call, it's basically version specific. It's not the same as with Windows Server call that I can access, or it needs to be the same version or lower. With RDS call, it should be the same, so it's not backwards compatible. So example, if I have a RDS call of 2008, I cannot connect to 2003, or if I have a 2012 RDS call, I cannot connect to 2008. So the only way for me, if I have an RDS call, if I want to connect to 2008, I need to downgrade the RDS call. Versus with Windows Server, there's no need to do a downgrade because it's backwards compatible. RDS calls requires an activation. Again, RDS calls are version specific and requires an activation. That's why it needs to be matched. So example, if I have a Windows Server 2012 RDS call, I cannot connect to Windows Server 2008. because it's not backwards compatible. So I have to do a downgrade for the RDS call. And RDS calls are the only calls that require activation. The Windows Server calls doesn't have an activation. RDS calls can be activated through the Remote Desktop Licensing Manager tool in Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2. So how to license RDS? So it needs to match with the Windows Server license. Windows Server Client Access License. So if you have an RDS call, you must have a Windows Server call, and it should match. If you have a user call, okay, if you have a Windows Server user call, the RDS call should be RDS user call as well. Again, if you have a Windows Server user call, the RDS should be user call as well, so that it's going to fully license the user. Now, if you have a Windows Server device call, the Remote Desktop Client Access License should be device calls as well. So again, if it's a Windows user call, it should be RDS user call. If it's a Windows device call, it should be an RDS device call to get fully licensed. So add RDS call for Remote Desktop Services access. So ask the questions to identify the opportunity. So if a customer wants to connect an application using Remote Desktop Services, then they need to have our RDS call. If a company provides session-based desktop or to any remote users, then they need to have an RDS call. Or any employees using iPhone, Android, Windows Phone apps for access to a virtual machine-based desktop or VDI, or remote app programs or session-based desktop, they need to have an RDS call and a Windows Server call as well. And Windows Server Client Access License are channel agnostic. So if you have an OEM license with server, you can still use the Client Access License, even if it's purchased through OEM or volume. So here are some frequently asked questions. So is each client access license tied to a specific user or device? The answer is yes. Calls will be assigned to specific users or devices. But if a user leaves the company or the device is retired, customer can reassign the client access license. It means you can transfer the client access license to a different person or to a different device if the user leaves in the company or the device is broken or lost. I have some extra client access license from older version that are not being used. Can this be applied to servers running a newer version? So the answer is no. Client must be the same version or most recent version of the Windows Server software they are accessing. So remember again the scenario earlier, the client access license needs to be the same version or higher than the operating system. Can I use both device call and user call to access the same server? Yes, customer can use device and user calls along with RDS calls to access the same server. But remember again, if you have a Windows Server user call, then you need to have RDS user call. If it's a Windows Server device call, it should be an RDS device call. If I'm virtualizing Windows Server 2003 workload, do I need Windows Server 2012 calls? The answer is yes, since you're accessing the Windows Server 2003 or Windows Server 2008 workloads through the Windows Server 2012 R2 host or the physical server. This is the example I said earlier. If you want to virtualize the Windows Server 2003 and put it on the physical host of Windows Server 2012, so in that example, you need to have a Windows Server 2012 calls. Do I need client access licenses for my administrator? So it depends. Windows Server 2012 R2 licensing allows up to 2 users or 2 devices to access the server software for the purposes of administration without calls. However, if the administrator also uses software or anything other than administration, such as checking email, then the administrator will need to have a client access license. So to get evaluation, get certified, and get trained, so here are just some sites you can check. So if you want to get trained, this is the good site. It's a Microsoft Virtual Academy. You can learn a lot of things on this site. Now, if you want to have a copy of this presentation, you can go to my OneDrive. That's the OneDrive site. It's case sensitive. So I thank you for taking our time and listening for this presentation. I hope you've learned some licensing with Windows Server 2012. And thank you again for listening.